All right. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for attending the webinar this morning, Systems Approach to Organic Agriculture. My name is Marla Carlson, and I'm the Executive Director at Sask Organics, and I'm on the board of the Prairie Organic Development Fund, and I'll be moderating today's session. Today, I'm speaking with you from Regina, Saskatchewan, Canada. We're situated on Treaty 4, the traditional homeland of the Nehiyawa, the Anishinaabe, the Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota, and the homeland of the Métis Chief Nation. Before I introduce our speakers and turn it over to Martin, we're going to go through a few quick slides. I'm just going to ask Deb to pin my my window so that everybody's windows aren't showing in the recording.
Yeah, you are pinned, so the recording should show that.
Great. Okay. All right, close down. So we'll start with some housekeeping. We're going to close down any unnecessary programs that might be running in the background. This will help with your quality, both video and audio. If you have any questions, please type them into the chat and we'll do our best to get to as many of them as possible at the end of the webinar or at the end of Martin's presentation. This session will be recorded and shared with registrants after the event. It will also be posted on the Sask Organics and the Pivot and Grow YouTube channels, as well as the Pivot and Grow website. And finally, please bear with us that no matter how many times we do this, there's sometimes technical glitches, and we'll do our best to make the session run as smoothly as possible for everybody. Just a quick acknowledgement of our funder, the Prairie Organic Development Fund. The Prairie Organic Development Fund has been around since about 2015, and we are an investment platform established to develop organic agriculture and marketing in the Canadian prairies. And we have two funds. One is called the Capacity Fund, and that helps to fund organizations in the 3 prairie provinces. And also our Innovation Fund, which helps to raise the 50-cent dollars for grants like the one we received to develop this curriculum. And then just a quick shout out to those Prairie Organic Development Fund sponsors. So our platinum sponsors, Grain Millers and Sask Wheat. Our silver sponsors, Nature's Path, the Bada Family Initiative on Canadian Seed Security, Prairie Heritage Seeds, and FW Cobbs, and of course, the Canadian Agricultural Partnership, which is the Government of Canada. And now why we're all here, the webinar itself. So the webinar will provide an overview of the materials presented in the soon to be released A Systems Approach to Organic Production resource by Martin Enns from the Department of Plant Science, University of Manitoba. The chapters of the document challenge readers to critically evaluate their farm resources, map their farming operation in order to better visualize the farm as a system, including the many connections, and strengthen their adaptive learning capacity. So Martin, for those of you who don't know Martin, he's a professor in the University of Manitoba's Plant Science Department, where he leads the Natural Systems Agriculture Lab. The goal of the program is to discover new ways of farming ecologically, to empower farmers with knowledge to design organic and ecological farming systems adapted to where they live, and to engage students in this exciting process. He leads the Glen Lee study, Canada's oldest organic conventional farming systems comparison study, which is in its 32nd season. In 2011, Martin started Canada's first farmer participatory wheat and oat breeding program focused on organic production. And you can read a fuller bio on our website. So we are very grateful for Martin to be here this morning, and he is such an incredible resource. His knowledge and skills have benefited many, and one of the things that I appreciate really the most about Martin is how he engages with farmers and how they inform what he does on a day-to-day basis. So thank you, Martin, for being here, and looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much, Marla. I'm assuming you can hear me. So
we can.
Okay, that's great. So I want to wish you all a very good day, good morning, or good afternoon, wherever you are. I'm doing this presentation from the University of Manitoba campus, which is on Treaty 1 territory in southern Manitoba. And the title, as Marla said, is a systems approach to organic agricultural production. This is a story I think each one of us could tell. Anybody who's grown anything and tried to create a system out of it, or just they bring their life into whatever they're producing, could tell this story. And I want to acknowledge that. But this is my story, and I really appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedules. We're recording this on a Friday. It's been a long week for all of you. It's been a long week for me. I have my thermos of coffee. It's the middle of the field season, but it's always fun to talk about organic agriculture. So let's get started. Charles Francis, sort of one of my mentors from the University of Nebraska, stated this: agriculture has evolved to become more fossil fuel intensive, less efficient in output per unit of energy input, and more global in their markets. Yet there is a more profound change taking place, mostly at the grassroots, a recognition that the resilience and sustainability of ecology and natural systems have much to teach modern agriculture. Organic farming systems are one of manifestations of this new awareness. And so that's a great way to introduce this subject, because it reflects on the energy that really powers our entire economy. And one of the measures that is very useful to me is to look at how much fossil fuel energy it takes to produce a unit of gross domestic product, or economic growth. And as you can see from the graph on the right, we used to use a lot more energy to produce economic growth than we do now. We've definitely improved, and that's a very good thing. Canada has a challenge. We require 33% more fossil fuel to produce a unit of energy than the United States. And if we compare ourselves to, let's say, the United Kingdom, we use almost twice as much fossil fuel to produce a unit of GDP. And if we compare ourselves to Germany or Australia, Australia uses less, Germany uses 25% less than the Americans use. We use 33% more. And the reason I'm showing you this is it gets us focused on the question of how energy efficient is organic agriculture, and how does it compare to what we're used to. And this table here that I've put together comes from various sources, a lot of it from the work of Pimentel and Pimentel in 2008, where they looked at the Mexican village corn. They're getting 10.7 units of energy out for every one going in. Pre-industrial England, 40 units out for every 1 unit going in. If we look at a lot of vegetable production, you actually have situations where you're getting less energy calorically in the food than it takes you to produce them. And if we look at Canadian grain production, it's about 8 to 1, maybe 6 to 1, maybe up to 9 to 1. And if we look at organic production, it is more efficient. And so that's really a way of warming us up to the idea that organic agriculture, as a manifestation of this ecological system, actually has something to offer us, because we know that we want to reduce our fossil fuel footprint, and maybe organic agriculture is one way to do that. But there are other challenges. For example, there's interest in biodiversity conservation, and Canada is signing on not only to carbon or greenhouse gas international treaties, but also international treaties around biodiversity. And if we look at what's happened in terms of the wildlife habitat capacity index, anything in the orange to red means that in the last 30 years, there's been a decline in wildlife habitat capacity. And that has really been something that agriculture is responsible for. And so we need to think about how the organic systems can help with biodiversity conservation. And then the final slide of sort of background information regards pesticide risk. And over the last 30 years, the pesticide risk has either been unchanged or gone up. And so this is something that makes people think, well, let's do organic agriculture because maybe it'll solve some of these challenges. And we all know the term, don't panic, eat organic, or eat mostly organic. And if we look at the projections for Canada, by 2040, it's projected that 6% of Canadian agricultural land will be organic. We can't predict the future with accuracy, but I think we can see a definite increase in production and interest. So that brings me to this module on sort of thinking about whole farm systems and organic. And the first chapter, the first section that I want to talk about are farm resources. Every farm has resources, land resources, human resources, infrastructure resources, and market resources. And I just want to highlight each of those, very briefly. Land resources. We classify agricultural land into good land and not so good land, but all land can be productive. And that's so important to recognize. And I think the indigenous cultures that farmed here years ago, and maybe still do, taught us that. One of the examples that I like to think about is a former graduate student who looked at organic livestock production on land bases which were not all that well suited to annual grain production. So these farms grew perennials and turned that perennial agriculture into the business of grass-fed organic livestock, either milk production or meat production. And so, the Myra had a chance to visit all these farms and to talk about the farmers, how did their system evolve to leveraging that perennial land base to create a livelihood. So all land has potential. And in fact, when we have perennials in our farming systems, certainly for most of Canada, we're mimicking what was there before cultivation. And that's a really good thing. The second resource is the human resources, the people. So I'm giving the example here of Villicus Farms because they employ, like a lot of other organic farmers, a lot of people who are not part of the immediate family, apprentices, others. And so I heard the term farmily from some farmers in southwestern Manitoba, and I want to give them credit. It was not me. But I love that term because it includes not only the immediate family, but all the other people that make that farm function. Those they are part of the human resource community that is important for the system. And there are issues around who gets to be in the family. And I just wanted to draw attention to this conversation podcast on how to combat the sexism faced by women farmers, who make up almost 30% of primary farm owner operators. So I think this is an important resource. The third resource is the infrastructure. And when I think about infrastructure, my mind always goes to the land base and the machinery, but that's because I'm an agronomist. But I also need to think about where the water is, where the three-phase power is, whether there are livestock, what kind of livestock. And so when we think about the resources and the infrastructure, what things should stay if you're converting a conventional farm to an organic farm, and what things should go? What new things might need to be acquired to make the farm function? So an infrastructure requires consideration. And finally, there's the markets. Markets are always markets. They go up and down. On the left bottom corner of the slide, I've shown von Thunen's 200-year-old map of markets relative to population centers, and you can read more about that in the notes. It may or may not be relevant to some farmers. The market is something that all farmers pay attention to. So if we're grain farmers in Alberta and we're selling to a buyer, 1,000 kilometers away, that's a particular marketing setup. Or we can look at 3Gen Organics here in Ontario, who actually have put a farm store up and are selling very locally, and they are close to a population center. And then when we think about markets, we also have to think about where the puck is going. And here's a newspaper article out of the Manitoba Cooperator, which just talks, here's a health economist talking about flax and pulses can reduce healthcare costs. And organic foods can be healthier. And I think that market is going to grow, maybe a little bumpy, but I think it is in our future. So this is the farm landscape. How do we see this landscape? We all see it a bit differently. Number one, we all live in a different farm landscape or in a different place where we're working with farmers. And number two, our brains work differently. And so one of the things that I've found to be useful is to get people to draw mind maps about their farm resources. What is a mind map? Well, we all use them. We visualize things, we make connections in our brains. And so here is an example of a mind map which a student made from an organic farm. So this is Organic Farm Y. Some of the infrastructure, buildings, animal health, welfare, resources, support, labor, soil health and quality. These are all things that the person saw the farmers focusing on. And then these were connected to other things. And so you had, for example, animal health and welfare. There was poultry, biosecurity, disease control, sanitation. All those things are linked to that poultry production. Over here for resources and support, we have institutions, farmer associations, marketing, and then marketing was over here linked to enhanced housing systems because people want to buy eggs from poultry, from chickens that are well looked after and have some fresh air and that type of thing. Here's another interesting connection. Automation is linked to shelter belts. And so maybe the person was thinking, well, if we have small, autonomous seeders, they can go around shelter belts and that will allow us to maintain them. So this is just an example of how we can see our system. And one of the things that Einstein used mind maps, and apparently he was actually not that good at math, and that makes me super happy. So cheers, Albert Einstein. But the thing about imagination, it has no boundaries. And so mind maps can help you learn and see connections that you may not be familiar with. So here, as an example, is a wild oat mind map. So we have a wild oat problem. And how can we deal with it? We can do patch treatment. We can do tillage or hay the patches. We can delay the seeding of our crop. But that means that we might need to change our crop, or we can go to taller varieties, or we avoid oats as a crop because the seed might be contaminated. So maybe we grow barley instead, or that's connected to a seed cleaner. And so you get the picture. You create that mind map, or some people call it an ecosystem around that problem. So for homework, I would challenge you to draw a mind map for the management of Canada thistle, which is a very, very difficult weed, and it actually drives people out of organic production in some cases. And compare that to the mind map for the management of dandelion. Dandelion has one taproot. It requires much different management than Canada thistle, which is the most sneaky, crafty weed that I can imagine. Okay, so now that we know what our resources are, let's get into some planning processes. I love this quote because I learned this the hard way many times. we don't plan to fail, but sometimes we fail to plan. So planning is important. And in the chapter that accompanies this video, I've talked about agronomic planning, like rotation, landscape, of course, data and record keeping, business planning, and then some of the threats and some of the questions. Rising land costs really are a challenge, maybe the way people have been doing things. And then I want to talk a little bit later about optimum farm size. So those are the things that I had listed, but if we we talk to the experts on planning, you know, they will propose a strategic planning hierarchy, something like this. They will, you know, we will work on a vision and then a mission, and then the tactics or the things that we need maybe to, you know, crimp roll our crop or to, you know, clean our seed. That's right at the bottom. And so my problem is sometimes I go right to tactics and I don't think enough about what the vision is. Or here's another version of a strategic planning process where you have the vision, the mission, and then you have the values. And I think this is quite important for organic production, because people who suffer through all the challenges of organic production, I think have different values, and I admire that. And so again, you have the projects at the bottom. So I would, you know, advise anybody to go through a formal or maybe less formal strategic planning process for their farm. I actually do that for my research program. Let me give you an example of a farm family in Quebec, and thank you, Matthew, for sharing these slides, and talk about their strategic plan. Matthew presented this at the Organic Alberta presentation, and I was just so impressed because they had values, they had a mission statement. So one of their missions is to be self-sufficient in inputs and machinery. They're designing their own machinery. They designed and built their own manure spreader, their own weed puller, their own tillage implement to allow one-pass control of perennials. One of their other missions is soil conservation. So for farms in Eastern Canada, to organic farms, to avoid moldboard plowing is quite radical. So they've gone to ridge tillage. So these are their tactics that they use to achieve the goals and those values. They have a goal of maintaining biodiversity, and they give basically the organic farming system credit for some of that. Also other habitat preservation tactics. And they have a goal of vertical integration. So they have built a flour mill on their farm, and they mill wheat that's produced right there in Quebec, and they sell it in the area and in the region. And they do all the smart things that millers do if they have a dry year and they have low dawn because there wasn't much fusarium. They keep some of that wheat for the next year. So this is another thing about their farm, is it's been around for more than 2 decades. And so they have been persistent. Now, when we're planning, we often have to make trade-offs, right? We hear that all the time. Politicians are saying, well, you know, we need to think about the economy, not just the environment. And I want to just give an example of how a trade-off between rotation excellence and sort of financial pressures can be a challenge. So this is a picture I took this spring at our Glenlee plots. And in the back of the plot, we have a rotation that has inadequate legumes. And remember, this is the 32nd organic crop that we're growing here. This is over 3 decades. And the front, we have oats growing where we've had adequate legume in the rotation. And you can see the crop is better. This is what it looked like several weeks later. You can see the line very clearly. Lots of nitrogen, a nice clean crop here. This crop also looks pretty clean, but it's nitrogen deficient. And here it is 3 days ago. The oats have headed out. And we can really see the difference. Again, there's the line. We see wild oats dominating over top of those tame oats, and there's very few wild oats here. And we did not pull any weeds. We just did inter-row cultivation. So what happened here? Well, in the back, we had a pretty good rotation for 30 plus years. We had a green manure, then wheat, then flax, then oats, and then it went back to a green manure. And this worked really well for close to 20 years. And then the weeds started building up. And so what we did in the front half of the plot is we hit the pause button on grain production, and we put a 5-year alfalfa stand in here. And then after 2020, we went back to wheat, flax, and oats, and now we're in 2023. And so really what we did is rehabilitate that system. And we changed our plan, we adapted our plan to deal with the fact that we didn't have enough nitrogen to grow big crops, and we had Canada thistle building up, and we had wild oats building up. And now, so that is that trade-off. And if we're still thinking we can't make this trade-off because we need income every year, you can see the system is really not doing very well. So I don't know if this really works, but for me, it illustrates that sort of trade-off. So in the notes that accompany this video, I have given some examples of crop rotations from across different parts of Canada. And I don't want to go through the individual details of them here, although at the bottom, I have highlighted some of the features of each rotation. So for example, this Quebec rotation has limited legumes. It has legumes, but some of the nitrogen comes from manure because manure sources are readily available. And that contrasts, for example, the Alberta system where they're growing a green manure nitrogen crop every 3rd year because they're not using manure. But the point I really want to make is that when you go on farm visits, you should ask the farmers why they use a specific rotation. And that will help you understand what their planning process was. What is the logic behind it? How did they get there? How did they change it over time? And so that really helps us learn a lot about planning. Now, the final planning slide I have here regards optimum farm size. And optimum farm size is interesting to me because here in the agriculture school where I teach at the University of Manitoba, most of the professors are pushing students over here. You want a large farm that can purchase and afford all the latest technology, and that will increase the total factor productivity or the economic health of the system. And so, you know, I've done some reading about this and I've done some thinking about this. And one of the realities that economists tell me is that we have this U-shaped reality when we relate farm size with profitability or total factor productivity. Small farms, very small farms, maybe 1 hectare or 2.5 acre vegetable farm run by one person with some helpers can be very profitable because labor efficiency is being maximized and machine demand is very low. But as we increase the farm size, labor efficiency drops and you need more machines. But if you have a much bigger farm, you can afford all those machine technologies. And that's why this is, you know, the least desirable place to be. And maybe we've seen this. A lot of the moderate sized farms have really struggled. But I ask myself the question, is this true for organic farming? Because in organic farming, we rely on ecological knowledge, not only technology. And where can this ecological knowledge best be deployed? Is it perhaps in a farm that's not so huge? my hunch is yes. And so this is something that you can think about as you plan your farms. Okay, the third section that I want to talk about today is learning systems. I'm just going to have another sip of my coffee here. Learning systems. All farms need a learning plan. Now, Vimy Ridge, for those of you familiar with Canadian history, was, it was a nation-building battle, which is pretty sad to think we built our nation around a battle, but that's the way it is. And the British and the French had trouble fighting the Germans in this part of France. I think it was France, because they had a very rigid system. The generals would not tell the soldiers what was going on. And so the only people with the knowledge were the people on top. And the person who led the Canadian Brigade was actually a real estate agent from Vancouver, had, I think, no real military training. And he made sure that everybody knew what the plan was, even the privates in the trenches. And I think you understand what I'm trying to say here is that not only do all farms need a learning plan, all members of the family need to know the plan and need to know what the goal is with using the plan. And so these apprentices need to be aware of what the farm owners are thinking and doing and trying to achieve with their farm. I hope I made my point. And my point is that all farms need a learning plan. People say, oh, that was effortless. Well, I'm sorry, learning is not effortless. So this is a quote, effortful learning. It's analogous to weight training. Lifting heavier weights, which require more effort, will build more muscle in much the same way that investing more effort in grappling with new information builds stronger, deeper knowledge. And so, whoops, sorry, I think I've been admitting some people. Maybe I don't need to do that. So learning is important, and learning is hard work. But as you learn, it gets easier because you're learning muscle. The muscle between your ears gets stronger and has a greater depth of knowledge. So the field day, which you see depicted on the right, is a really important way to learn. And when you go to a field day, like, ask questions, learn. Don't just go and stand in the back and be passive. You can be quiet, but engage the information in a critical way. And there will be things that you don't know. Ask questions or find out what's going on. So effortful learning. And then you need to ask yourself, what are your learning goals? Well, people who've worked on ecological agriculture have some advice for us. And Steve Gleesman here and Iveta Perfecto are two that I admire. So they have this different levels of engaging learning. Actually, these 4 steps come from a Canadian Stuart Hill from McGill. The first level is to increase the efficiency of conventional practices. So maybe get a tractor that has better fuel efficiency, okay? Number 2, substitute conventional practices with alternative practices. Maybe use a wide blade cultivator to kill Canada thistle instead of a high-speed disc, which destroys aggregates. But what our authors are saying is that where you should really be putting your attention in terms of learning is to redesign the system so that it functions ecologically, or as they say, on the basis of a new set of ecological relationships. So if we're taking the educational elevator, we want to go up to level 3. And that brings us to ecological knowledge. This is knowledge of species, both plants and animals, the biophysical characteristics of the environment through space and time. An example is a rancher who tracks the pasture and rangeland condition alongside the health of the grazing animal. So ecological knowledge is something that we haven't been paying enough attention to. Certainly in the ag schools, it's only recently that the environment sort of features larger in the agricultural curriculum. But I want to go through some definitions. Here goes. There are more in the notes that accompany this section. An ecosystem is all the biotic, which is the living creatures, and the abiotic, which is things like wind, components that interact within an area at once. Think of a farm or even a farm field as an ecosystem. Use a mind map to show the parts and the connections within that farm ecosystem. Then there's biodiversity. It's the variation of species in an ecosystem. How many plant species are growing in a pasture, for example? Other ecological terms are competition, which is a mutually detrimental interaction between species which share limited resources. On the right, I'm showing you a picture of wheat and flax intercropped, and we got the flax seeding rate wrong. We made it way too high, and so it outcompeted the wheat. And then within competition, there's two different kinds. There's interspecific competition. This is between individuals of different species, for example, wild oats and wheat, or in this famous example from Canada, wild mustard competing with, I think it's barley. And then we have intraspecific competition, and this is competition between the same species. So here we have a field of oats, and we can increase the seeding rates to compete with weeds, but there comes a point at which we increase it too much and the plants compete with each other and the yield potential goes down. A couple of other terms I'll go through quickly. A food web is an interlocking pattern formed by a series of interconnecting food chains. And I think we've all seen this picture. And ask yourself, what does the food web look like in my field? Decomposers. This is super important. In organic agriculture, a lot of what we do is decompose things. Basically, for example, we decompose the legume using bacteria to make the nitrogen available to another crop. Or bacteria help to decompose high carbon straw in soil. Second last slide, generalist species. This is something that can thrive under many environmental conditions. So some grasshopper species would be considered generalists. And then a niche is the role that an organism plays in an ecosystem, including both the environmental conditions it needs and its interactions. And so wild mustard and red root pigweed are non-mycorrhizal plants. So their niche is soils with high levels of available phosphorus, because mycorrhiza fungi help plants access phosphorus. So the picture at the bottom here is from our Glenlee long-term plots. And this is organic flax, which is a highly mycorrhizal plant. It can go get phosphorus almost all the time. But the back half of the plot has not received any manure. And so it's phosphorus deficient. So there's no mustard or less mustard. So the niche for mustard is the front half of the plot where there's more phosphorus available from manure that has been added. And the final ecological term is disturbance. And I really want to make the point that tillage is not the only disturbance. Spraying a herbicide or a fungicide is also disturbance. It's disturbing the plant community by taking some plants out or reducing some fungi. So I guess just to recap, my point is that if we want to design systems based on ecology, we need to have some ecological knowledge. I think organic farmers have often, on average, better ecological knowledge than their chemical farming neighbors. And I would say farmers who have both crops and livestock have even a higher level of ecological knowledge. That's a generalization. But how do we get that ecological knowledge? This is the way we want to get it, through what we call an ecological understanding model, where it's cultural, where you go to a farm meeting and you talk about ecological practices. You talk about, hey, how are the peas nodulating? What's your nitrogen fixation going to be like this year? As opposed to the depletion crisis model on the left, which is when things collapse and you learn by accident, like the cod fishery collapsing in Eastern Canada. That's not the way you want to learn about ecology. And one of the examples I really love is the beavers and water management. And I just learned this a few years ago, that when the indigenous communities were trapping beaver for the fur trade, they for a long time did not trap beavers in the Great Plains, because beavers were helping with water management. And if they killed the beavers, there'd be no dams and there'd be nothing for the buffalo to drink. So the buffalo wouldn't come and there'd be nothing for the people to drink. Little example. We also then, you need to use that ecological knowledge to adapt to new circumstances, because nothing ever, changes except change itself, right? So we're always adapting to change, whether it's new knowledge of seed varieties, or on the left, learning that our soil is got compaction and we need to do something about it. And let me give you an example that I think is amazing for organic agriculture. Blade rollers are something that farmers are experimenting with, and some farmers really like them, some don't. The history of the blade roller is it was first used in the tropics to crush down mulches for conservation agriculture in smallholder farms. And I've seen people drag logs across a green manure in Honduras as a form of with a horse, as a way to crush the green manure. But what a lot of organic farmers have done is adapted the roller to new situations. Of course, everybody knows the example of fall rye and soybeans, or hairy vetch and corn. But now we see, for example, on the bottom left-hand corner, dryland farmers in the prairies adapting the blade roller to kill this green manure cover crop without using tillage. And so this is an example of applied ecology, in my opinion, and it shows the way that we can adapt. Adaptation is really, really important. The final chapter that I want to talk about today is crop livestock integration. I guess the short answer is that integrating ruminants or pigs or other monogastrics with crop production has the potential to make, some of the best organic systems. But that's not what's been happening in agriculture in Canada or much of the developed industrialized world. Back in the old days, in the 1500s, in Europe, they had crop systems and the grazing systems were on the common lands. Then over time, these enterprises were combined into mixed farming systems. And so the 4-year crop rotation in Northern Europe, the 7-year crop rotation, these were really good systems that were heavily based on ecological processes. And with industrialization of agriculture, and especially the availability of nitrogen fertilizer, this system was abandoned to go back to specialized crop production and specialized livestock. And so, the question I've been asking myself for a long time is it hopeless? Are we just, stuck with these specialized systems? And so, the answer that I've come to is no. We don't have to be stuck in these systems. If farmers want to be specialized organic crop farmers, they can get involved in what we call area-wide crop livestock integration, simply by getting some of the manure from the livestock operation onto their land. So that may seem like a very simple thing, and why do you need a fancy diagram to depict that? Well, I did. Or some farms might go back to having ruminant livestock, even though they're predominantly grain, or they could have grain, even though they're predominantly beef farmers or sheep farmers, because there are some synergies there. Some of the grains that can't go to market can be fed through the animals. So I'd like you to think about whether you are going to integrate at the local level with a mixed system or at the area-wide level. But leaving farms separated like this is kind of a recipe for non-sustainability. I think that's just the reality. Maybe in the future we'll have nutrients from cities available to organic farmers. That would be great. So there's lots to think about there. So we've written quite a bit on organic crop livestock integration, and I'm just going to sort of end off with a couple of slides just to show the major components as we see them. So we have the pasture. So if you're grazing animals, the perennial pasture is so important. It's the cheapest way to feed livestock. And the considerations there are grazing management, species composition, but also pathogens, things like worms when it comes to sheep, for example. So you can deal with some of that with good grazing management. Over here, we have the arable crop rotation, and you have crop cycling there, and some of those crops are fed to animals. And animals provide manure and other livestock services. For example, maybe the livestock can help deal with your weed problem. And we have other inputs into the animal production, feed supplements, for example, grain legumes to boost the protein, chicory for parasite control. You could put the chicory right in the pasture. We've got other health issues. We might want to look at isothiocyanates or diatomaceous earth for improving the health of the animal. And then in organic production, we also have the question of animal welfare. So this is kind of that mind map around crop livestock integration. And maybe you can draw your own with your own unique features. So let's talk about the crop rotation. One of the standard ways of improving the crop rotation, if you have livestock, is you get to grow perennial legumes like alfalfa or clover. And I just wanted to let you know that all these places where there's stars is where long-term studies either have been conducted or still are being conducted that look at this exact question. What is the role of perennial forages in the crop rotation? And here's some data from northern Alberta. And it shows that this is bushels per acre of wheat in year 1, 2, 4, and 5 after terminating either alfalfa, alfalfa brome, brome grass, red fescue grass, or just fallow. And we can see that the alfalfa in the rotation, or the alfalfa grass, is giving us the best residual effect in terms of growing higher yielding wheat crops. And it's certainly a lot better than the fallow. So we have quite a bit of knowledge on this crop rotation business. The other thing that's been happening in organic production is farmers, when they grow their green manures, instead of just losing money on the field, they've been grazing those green manures. And this is a really good idea if it works for you, because it gives you some income from that grazing year. And in the chapter, there's a whole section on grazed green manures. I also like to use the crop livestock model to figure out how to bring nutrients into the system. So we've talked about nitrogen through legumes and through, forages in the crop rotation. So those green arrows are nitrogen from basically legumes. And I always tell the diploma students that they always, when they're new to organic agriculture, they get all excited about using manure. And I say, well, unless you have a small land base and lots of animals, or a trucking company to bring your manure to you for no cost, getting nitrogen from manure is too expensive. You have to grow your own nitrogen. What we need to use manure for is the phosphorus and the other nutrients. And so in the brown box and bars here and arrows, I've talked about sources of phosphorus, feed supplements, imported forage, or imported manure. And the rates at which you use that manure should be based on how much phosphorus you need to keep your system functioning. And so I've drawn a little diagram about how you can be scientific about this whole process. So now the crop rotation is on the left here. It's a bit confusing. So on the arable lands, we need to know what the nutrient content of our fields are and the nutrient content of our pastures. And if we want to use the manure from our own operation, we have to recognize that if we have a low phosphorus pasture, then that's going to end up producing low phosphorus manure. And so testing the manure for its phosphorus content, and if you're in a part of the world where you need potash or micronutrients, get the manure tested. And that will help you know. So if this is a phosphorus deficient pasture and a phosphorus deficient cropland farm, then just taking the manure from that farm and putting it back on the land is not going to help very much. That farm needs to import manure that has higher levels of phosphorus, or import some other source of phosphorus, like maybe bone meal, or hopefully in the future, struvite. So that's taking that mind map of crop livestock integration and applying some ideas of when you need to analyze the plant material, the soil, or the manure. And I'm almost done, but I couldn't resist but putting a picture of alfalfa next to Canada thistle. And why did I do this? Well, it's because Canada thistle is a problem, and it has caused farmers to abandon certain fields or maybe the whole organic farm. And that's exactly what happened at our Glenlea rotation when we had the green manure, wheat, flax, oat rotation for 2 decades. The Canada thistle built up, and we've been using a comb cut for the last 6 years, and it has made a difference in the cereals, but nothing kills Canada thistle quite as well as a 3 to 4 year alfalfa hay crop. And the mechanism is really quite elegant. It's really very ecological. In the springtime, when the alfalfa regrows, the Canada thistle elongates to try to capture some light. And that makes that thistle look very different than when the thistle is growing with wheat. And then along comes the hay bind or the swather, and you cut that alfalfa off, and you cut the thistle off, and you deplete the rootstock of the thistle. And you do that for a number of cycles, and it's quite effective. So that brings me to the end of today's webinar. I'd like to thank you for your attention. I want to remind you that there are a set of notes that accompanies this webinar, which gives you a lot more detail. And I thought I'd also put a plug in for our field day, which is August 1st, but you can join us online. All you have to do is go to that QR code, and you can participate in the entire field day from the comfort of your tractor cab. Thank you very much, Marla. I will stop sharing and turn it back over to you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Martin. Yeah, just my immediate reflection is that, you know, in our industrialized world, we've become increasingly specialized, right? And so to have a presentation that is specialized, meaning, well, it's not a systems approach. How we've got here now isn't a systems approach, and I think that we're better understanding that in many parts of, you know, our lives and economies, we need to have that sort of, I was going to say helicopter, and then I thought, no, maybe now it's like the drone view, right, of what we're doing. And being that mind map idea, I think is so great, because you don't, you know, you just start putting things down onto paper and then seeing the connections. And I think that is what's going to help us, you know, in farming and in other areas that we desperately need to address in our industrialized Western world. So thank you so much for that. There is a couple of questions. One is about the roller crimper, and I always get those in the wrong order, but the question was, would the roller just mentioned be the same as crimping? And I think it's a roller crimper, but I didn't want to answer that question because I wasn't 100% sure. And then did you see the next question is, what challenges, gaps in knowledge exist pertaining to the organic crop livestock production system you referenced earlier? and then maybe this is too broad. My particular interest is to integrate crop management.
Okay, so the first question was, is the crimper roller as good as the same as a roller?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So like a roller for pulses will not crimp roll. A crimper roller actually has blades on it that crimps the stem just like a hay bind would crimp the forage, and that helps it dry. That's what kills the plant. Just a soybean roller or a pea roller will not do that. But Neil, I forget his last name, from Eastern Saskatchewan, built a roller, really heavy one, and they put rods at the bottom of the blades so that to make sure the blade didn't cut the material, just crimped it. As far as that second question goes, what are the challenges of crop livestock integration? I think maybe when I talk to my ag economist colleagues, they talk about some of the advantages, like you can have two enterprises, and that can help you with your farm budgeting and your, the way you qualify for programs and taxation. So I think there's quite a few benefits of it. Biologically, there's huge benefits. The challenges, of course, are labor, knowledge. Does your land have fences, or do you have to start from scratch? Watering systems, all this costs money. So there's infrastructure costs. And in North Dakota, they've done some testing to see if a farm that never had beef animals went to beef animals, what's the infrastructure startup cost. So that type of information is available. But there's also the challenge of, do you want time for holidays? And, when you're running multiple enterprises, you're on the farm 380 days a year. And so there's all kinds of ways of dealing with that through the use of a Farmily, so that you do have maintain your own sanity and mental health through the process. I do know of some young farmers that are organic that actually have livestock where they never used to, because it just allows them to have a better crop rotation.
Great, thanks. Thanks for that, Martin. Are there any more questions or comments? Just gone. We are at the top of the hour, 10 o'clock. So if there aren't any more questions, we just want to say we have a few slides that we're going to go through here to end the webinar. But thank you so much, Martin. And just to remind people on the call that this recording will be made available to you, and there is a series of recordings being put together by Martin and Deb. So those will be available on the Pivot and Grow website in the next few weeks, we're hoping. So if you want to do a deeper dive, and there will be notes as Martin talked about in his presentation. So there'll be the recordings and the notes that he's put together for this series. So we're really grateful for that, to have it documented. Oh, we have a quick question about alpha thistle example. Can you also graze the alfalfa?
I think the question was, can you kill thistle with grazing? I mean, in terms of the animal group that is most effective against thistle, it's goats first, and then sheep, and then cattle. We had a sheep herd at the university for years, and they would strip the Canada thistle down. I mean, beef cattle don't do it as well, but there's other strategies you can do. If you have a patch of thistle, you might put a round bale there and have the animals go and graze the round bale, and they'll just trample and smother the thistle. So they will have some impact. I think when we talk about grazing for weed control, we really want to do some form of grazing control, where we put the animals in a small area for a short period of time, and that gives us more weed control. The animals are going to do some thistle damage. The other thing about most grazing systems is there's a good chance you're going to want to cut some hay, because you have too much pasture, or the you can't get the animals around fast enough, maybe fence off those thistle areas of the field and make sure you cut those. Thanks for the question. Back to you, Mark.
And you know, of course, Martin, we did have one more question. It's always when you say there's no more questions, there's always two. And it was a question about biofertilizers and biopesticides, and do they work well in the systems integration? And that will be the last one.
Yeah, I mean, biological fertilizers, you know, there's been a lot of research on them, and the results are unfortunately not that impressive. Where you do see them working is in the tropics, where you have almost no organic matter and a very different soil system. But you know, the thing about our soils in Canada, they're among the best soils in the world. They're any soil that has, you know, 2, 3, 4, 8% organic matter is an amazing soil when you compare it to the rest of the world. That means there's so much life in there. All you have to do is wake that life up with a good crop rotation, a diversity of plants, and plants on the surface most of the year. That has proven to be much better than these biologicals. But biological insecticides, that's a different story. That has more legs. Things like neem and even the spinosads that are used for Colorado potato beetles. So there are biological pesticides that can be very useful in organic.
Perfect. Thank you for that, Martin. All right, so we'll just move and just to put another plug in for the Natural Systems Agricultural Tour that'll be happening on the 1st of August, and to remind you that you can attend in person or by scanning the QR code. So would encourage you to attend. And then Sask Organics also has a couple of field days coming up. We're co-hosting one with the Swift Current Research and Development Center in Swift Current on July 27th. And then also we're doing one on August the 10th with TCO Cert Chapter 4. So you can find out more information about that on our website if you just go to the events page. And then last but not least, a big thanks to Dr. Enns for his presentation today, and thank you all for attending. Have a great rest of your day and weekend.